Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to the Institute's virtual book launch featuring Professor Mona Tajali's Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey. We are grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for sponsoring the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series and book launch. At the outset, I would like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach in their ancestral homeland. I welcome Professor Mona Tajali of Agnes Scott College to the University of Toronto, Negar Bani Safar, an Iranian studies graduate student at the University of Toronto, is introducing Professor Tajali and will moderate today's session. Negar, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Tawakkoli, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm so honored to be moderating today's session and welcoming Dr. Mona Tajali to talk about her recent book, followed by a question and answer section. Dr. Mona Tajali is an associate professor of international relations and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Agnes Scott College, a historically women's liberal arts college in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Tajali's research, teaching, and activism are centered on women's rights and empowerment as they resist gender discrimination and limited opportunities arising from patriarchal structures. A firm believer in engaging across the academic-practitioner divide, she is committed to research questions that have practical implications. To this end, she has disseminated her findings to audiences inside and outside academia, including civil society. Her publications, with 2 books published as open access, are centered around questions of how to elect more women to positions of political power, reduce barriers that keep women out of politics, and further empower women as political actors. Her essays, expert interviews, and consultations have appeared in media outlets such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Nation, and CNN International. As a result of her research expertise in women and politics in Muslim context, she has collaborated with the Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, since 2007. In 2019, she was elected as part of WLUML's executive board and the principal investigator of its multi-sided Women and Politics project. Her first book, Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women, co-authored with Homa Houtfar, has been translated into Persian and Arabic and is widely used as a training manual for those advocating for women's increased political representation across the Muslim world. Today, Professor Tajali will discuss her recently published book, Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table, which investigates how religious and cultural norms, attitudes, institutional structures, and voter behavior affect the representation of women and quality of democracy in Muslim context, with a comparative focus on Iran and Turkey. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tajali to the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. Professor Tajali, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tawakkoli Targhi, for your invitation, for all of your organizing efforts. Thank you so much, dear Negar, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen with permission. And okay, Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides. So yes, I wanted to say welcome to everyone here. It's a great pleasure to be able to discuss my book that was just published at the end of fall of last year by Edinburgh University Press, titled Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table. This book, like most other books that we know, it took nearly a decade to finish. My first time being in the field was 2009 in both countries. And then the last time I was in the field for this research was 2019. So I'm really grateful that now I get to talk about it. And of course, it has also come out, it has been published at a time when it is quite relevant for us to think critically about women's political rights, women's political participation, women's political representation, not just in the context of Iran and Turkey, but across the region, and I would say also globally, right? I think a lot of this research on these issues have been somewhat understudied. So we need to, so one of the things of my research is to maybe shed some light onto the historical agitations in terms of women's political participation and representation. I'm not going to talk about the entire book. I'm not going to do a sort of a, trying to change my slides. There you go. Okay. Yes, I'm not going to do an entire summary of the book. That's because the book is freely available for download from Edinburgh University's website. It was really important for me to make sure that those who inspire this research, particularly the grassroots activists, particularly the members of the women's rights movement, to be able to have access to it. And also one of the case country studies for this research, Iran, continues to be under economical sanctions, and we know libraries and access to academic publications is just really difficult. So I'm very grateful to my institution, Agnes Scott College, to have been able to secure the funds for me to be able to publish this as open access. So you can just freely download it and disseminate it. If you like a hard copy, yes, the hard copy is definitely also available. But I think it's really important for us to be able to talk across different countries, different contexts. So as Negar Jan mentioned, dissemination of scholarly research as well as activist work is extremely important, particularly for women as well as other marginalized populations. So to start with, these are some of the images that we know. Of course, we're getting a lot of these images at the moment with regards to the women-led protests in Iran, but these are some of the images that we see in relation to gender and politics in the Muslim world, including in the two case study countries of my research of both Iran and Turkey. So what we do know is that women are not apolitical. We do know that women, not just now, but historically, have composed highly politicized and socialized sections of their societies. And there's evidence of this. There's evidence of this not only by their street presence and their street protests, but also in other ways. We know that women do turn out to vote at very high rates, at least at the same level as men in majority of the Muslim countries, including in Iran and Turkey, and sometimes even suppressing men's rate of voter participation, unless there's a boycott involved. When in that case, we actually see women exercising their political right to boycott an election at slightly higher rates than men. So within the last two elections in Iran, we actually saw, which were pretty much, there was a very dominant boycott campaign that was launched. We saw that women actually boycotted 2 percentage points higher than their male counterparts. We also know that women do tend to be very mobilized in political groups, political parties. Of course, in Iran, we don't have a very strong history of political parties, but the times that we have had, we do see women getting very much involved. We also know in terms of around times of elections, women do compose a really major engine, so to say, of the electoral sort of recruitment, right? They get really energized, particularly when candidates actually discuss some of their demands. In the case of Turkey, there is actually a very long history of political party organizing and institutionalization. So we also see women being highly active at various political parties, including within the ruling Justice and Development Party, or the AKP party. In fact, the AKP party has been priding itself as having the largest female membership of any political party in the world. In 2020, they cited in their publications that women compose 4.7 million members of the political party. I would contest that they are the largest, they have the largest female membership of any political party, but we do know that they very much have relied on women sort of being members, being supporters of the political party throughout the past 20 years of them being in party. Right now, it's definitely decreasing, but nonetheless, they have very much relied. Erdogan has very much relied on women's presence. And also, we know there's evidence of women running NGOs or other charity organizations that are quite political acts, particularly within the context where the state has failed to deliver some of the key services, is when women have been able to step up. But then the question becomes that despite women's interest and engagement in politics, they rarely reach high-level political decision-making positions. So what we actually have is what I call a gap between women's political participation or their political interest or them seeing themselves as political actors and political representation. And by that, I mean women's descriptive representation. By that, I mean women actually numerically being in high-ranking political decision-making positions. And this is across the two different countries. And this is also the case where globally women are politically underrepresented. But when we look at across the world in terms of the regional performances, the Middle East and North Africa often performs extremely low. Iran ranks among one of the lowest countries in the world, among 189 countries in terms of women's parliamentary presence. Turkey is slightly higher than that, but still very much below the global average. So there's been a lot of literature to explain why is this gap? So there's a lot of traditional explanations. Among them, the conventional explanations is the work of Stephen Fish and Ronald Engelhardt and Pippa Norris that have argued that maybe it's Islam or Muslim culture that is failing to jump on the rising tide, for instance, in terms of gender equality. So they're blaming a lot on sort of those patriarchal cultural structures that just prevent women being in high-level decision-making positions. Another explanation has been oil production by Michael Ross, who says that because of the fact that oil-producing countries have sort of delayed women's entrance into the public sphere, that has translated into women's less presence within the political sphere. And also other bodies of literature that have blamed it on women themselves, arguing that women themselves are apolitical, they're passive, they're subjects of male control, they're not throwing their hat in the ring when it comes to wanting to be council members or parliamentarians and so on and so forth, and other bodies of literature that very much has highlighted that sort of the engine aspect of women's political participation that I talked about, that women are largely foot soldiers on behalf of political parties, but rarely in decision-making roles. What a lot of these bodies of literature, however, are pointing to are sort of monocausal explanations. And that's something where my research I'm questioning. And I'm saying that women's political participation and representation is due to a number of different factors and actors. And therefore, it would be quite limiting to just say it's Islam or it's oil or it's so we need to really have a much more comprehensive image of what's actually taking place. And also what a lot of this research sort of ignores is what about women's own political aspirations? How do women themselves view themselves as political actors, and so on and so forth. So my extensive research with the comparative look on Iran and Turkey is specifically to address this. It's specifically a bottom-up approach where I'm highlighting or I'm prioritizing and I'm centering women's own understandings of themselves in terms of political actors and women's own push to be able to, and campaigning and organizing to put pressure on political elites to be in political decision-making positions. And so in this regard, my research is sort of highlighting the structure and agency sort of dynamic that we know. So in both of these countries, there's been a historical push for women to be seen as political actors. Right before this call, Professor Tawakkoli Targhi and I were discussing about this long history, where he's citing, publications as early as 1920s, publications as early as even before that, where women were articulating their rights in black and white, certainly during the Constitution era, that they need to be political actors. So this is historical for the case of both countries, where the feminist movements and the women's movements demanded women being at the decision-making table. Within the Iranian context, in the mid-1990s, as well as in the Turkish context, in both countries, we saw sort of an uptick take place in terms of women really campaigning around this ever since the mid-1990s. And that's because the international community, with the UN Platform for Action that was released in 1995, for the first time really put the blame for women's political underrepresentation onto the states. That it basically put the responsibility onto the states to say, hey, if women are not in influential positions of power, it's because they're facing systemic discrimination and marginalization, and therefore the states need to take action in order to integrate more women into positions of power. With that shift in framing, women's groups across the ideological spectrum in both contexts became quite significant to be able to push for these. So I argue that women's political representation is impacted by diverse obstacles and opportunities arising out of political, legal, institutional, and social structures in their context. And my research is really about how are women maneuvering within these structures to bring about these changes. So yes, women's political activism, they've been demanding a seat at the decision-making table at least since the mid-1990s. And this has been regardless of their religious and ideological tendencies. And I think this is important for us to keep in mind, that it was not just secular reformist women that were pushing for greater access to positions of power. It also included religious women. It also included other, ethnic minority groups and so on and so forth. So one of the things that in my book I'm very keen to do is to include the voices of the diverse groups of women who have been campaigning for women's greater access to politics. In Turkey, this included self-identified women who were pious, or religious, secular women, as well as ethnic Kurds. Anybody doing any research on gender and politics in Turkey needs to pay particular attention to the Kurdish women's rights movements, because they have been absolutely at the forefront of some of the key debates and discussions around gender and politics, and therefore that's been quite significant. Within the Iranian context, it's been quite significant to include women who identify as conservative or usulgarayan or principalists, the women who were reformist, and as well as secular women's activists. And the historical organizing that women have done around this, those sort of agitations that I said, the campaigns sometimes, the pushes, the publications, the statements that they issued demanding a seat at the decision-making table has had surprising successes, in the sense that women have reached political office despite the constraints of very conservative gender ideologies, as well as authoritarian systems in which they maneuver, in which they've been forced to make some changes. So what are some of those examples of those surprising successes? So this is a table showing the percentage of women parliamentarians in Turkey. The case of Turkey is quite significant because Turkey is the first country in the region to have granted women the right to vote, which was as early as 1934. This is before France, this is before Switzerland. And yet for decades, we see women's political representation is only around 1 to 2%. And then it has a very notable increase with the coming to power of the conservative religious political party, which is the Justice and Development Party. Justice and Development Party first took office in 2002. And as we know, it remains in power today. The elections are coming up in a couple of months. So we'll see if it can still remain in power. But nonetheless, this is one of those examples that despite the dominant structure remaining quite patriarchal and having a conservative gender ideology, we see this notable increase in terms of women's parliamentary presence. The other example, very similarly, is with regards to what happened in Iran, in the sense that Iran's first and only post-revolutionary minister was one that was delivered not by the reformists who had promised on this, but by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And this is when, right after the very contentious election of 2009, Ahmadinejad went and he nominated 3 women as potential members to his cabinet as ministers, and a conservative-dominated parliament accepted the nomination of one, the woman in the middle, Marzieh Vahid Dastgirdi, who became the Minister of Health. Again, this is surprising and puzzling to many of us because Ahmadinejad, unlike his more reformist counterparts, especially during that particular election, was the only one who did not promise that he was going to deliver a female candidate, and he also never even campaigned on this promise. And yet he was the one who delivered. Rouhani, who came after him, was unable to even nominate women as ministers. So in order to explain these puzzles, in my book, I rely on two central elements of political process theory, which are political opportunity structures and framing processes, and in which I show how certain openings or certain political and discursive opportunity structures are able to enable women's groups to demand women's access to politics in a way that garners the most public support and yields the most pressure on the elites. And so this is where women are looking for those moments, those opportunity structures to present themselves in order to more forcefully present their demands and articulate their demands and lobby key figures in power. Similarly, political elites, having realized women's political might at the ballot box, are taking measures to strategically recruit women to formal politics. It has gone to the point where in both countries, male political elites, regardless of their gender ideology, which even though it could be a conservative gender ideology, can no longer flat out ignore women's demands, and they still have to pay lip service to women's organizing. And this is what we see, what scholars have called sort of instrumentalization of women's rights, where maybe they're nominating token women in order to appeal to the voters or in order to appeal to the international community. So these are those examples of those surprising successes that I was talking about, in the sense that it might just be satisfying women's descriptive representation and not necessarily women's substantive representation. But nonetheless, these are, in the eyes of many members of the women's rights movement, it could be that it's breaking a taboo, or nonetheless, it's increasing people's expectations of women's political roles, including for women themselves. So given suitable opportunities, both groups interact with one another in order to further their interests. So sort of they engage in what we call strategic interactions. So with regards to so my book actually engages in what we call an institutionalist analysis of gender and politics in Iran and Turkey. This is the first book that specifically looks at the various institutions within both states and how gender is thought about and sort of either supported or marginalized in terms of women's political representation. By institutions, I mean, I look at the office of the presidency. In the case of Iran, I look at the Guardians Council to see, do they look at, when they get the applications of male candidates and female candidates, do they look at them differently just based on their gender? And my research finds yes. So these are some of those nuances that we know these institutions are overwhelmingly authoritarian and undemocratic, but yet the next step would be to also see what are their implications on gender. And although women tend to be much lower percentage of candidates or those willing to throw in their hat, we see that they actually get sidelined at a much higher rate than the male counterparts, although men are usually the higher sort of higher percentage of those candidates. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A session. So in this institutionalist analysis, I wanted to do a comparative research, and I think I should explain why I picked Iran and Turkey. And that's because these two countries share a number of similarities with one another, while they also differ with one another on a number of important institutions and histories that are important for us to have a much more comprehensive picture of gender and politics in an effort to move away from the limitations of those monocausal explanations that I explained earlier. So both states are considered hybrid states. That's a similarity, though it is to two different degrees. By hybrid states, I mean that both of them have authoritarian features. If, for instance, there's no democratic way of putting candidate lists together in either country. In Turkey, it's the party leaders that put the party lists together in their closed party list with very little input from their members or the general public. Whereas in Iran, as we know, we have the body of the Council of Guardians. Yet they also have Republican features in the sense that you have sort of regular elections, and voters in both contexts take elections quite seriously, unless they want to, again, as I said, take a political act to boycott elections, which in itself, or boycott a particular political party, which in itself is a quite important political move, which, as we know, for the Middle East, there's a very rich literature on that. With regards to the role of religion, it was also really important because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the schools of thought of why women are so underrepresented across the Middle East is that, well, it has to do with Muslim culture. So that's where I wanted to compare a theocracy, Iran, with a secular state that, although religion is becoming much more prominent in Turkish politics, The laws on the land, unlike in Iran, do not to date do not have any specific restrictions on gender in particular. For instance, the office of presidency, the prime ministership, and so on and so forth, or judgeship. There's no restrictions like that the way we see in Iran, and that in itself, I think, it's an important factor to keep in mind. In fact, Turkey has had a female prime minister, Tansu Çiller. Also, another important similarity is that they both have very active women's rights movements. I think that's something that is quite significant. And these women's rights movements have also been quite intersectional in the sense that you have secular women's rights activism, you have religious women's rights activism. Sometimes you see them coming together with a unified platform on a particular campaign. Some of them, you see them shifting apart. One thing that my research finds is that throughout the past 40 plus years of the Islamic Republic, Iranian women have had a much easier time joining forces across the ideological spectrum, whereas it has been much more difficult for that to be achieved in the Turkish context because of that legacy of sort of extreme secularization that many of the religious groups felt harshly marginalized. That legacy has certainly remained until today. And also both countries have experienced periods of top-down secularization and Islamization, but of course, it's been to different degrees. And women's groups in both countries have exploited their respective Republican, authoritarian, and in the case of Iran, in Islamic institutions to further their bargaining efforts for women's greater access to political office. So women have been really good with using anything that they have at their disposal in order to maneuver from within these structures that we know are quite limiting to begin with, these structures that are quite authoritarian and male-dominated to begin with. So I'm really emphasizing the power and agency of the women to be able to push for some of these changes. So some of my findings, as I said, I'm not going to go through it chapter by chapter, but basically the book is divided into the Turkey part as well as the Iran part, where I look at, first I give a history of women's political rights and organizing in both contexts, and then I also highlight sort of what are the political opportunities that they each faced in order to have these surprising successes, and what were some of the limitations that they faced, and at the same time, what were some of the discursive opportunities, and where is this going? So that's where the structure of the book comes in. So for the findings on political opportunities, I find that electoral competition is actually a quite significant opportunity structure within the, as I said, the already very limited structures that women have to maneuver within. And what I mean by that is when political parties, in the case of Turkey, have been able to basically, at the time of elections, every voter talks about like, oh, which party is actually going to be more inclusive of women. And this fact that it has become sort of a national agenda and a public discourse has been thanks to women's organizing. The poster that you see is from a poster of a Turkish organization called Kader, which is the Association for Training and Supporting Female Candidates. And in this particular poster, women are highlighting the dominant parties, and they're saying how they tell them like, hey, I want to be a candidate. And what they hear in return is basically tone-deaf politicians who do not hear them, who just misunderstand or misinterpret their understandings, except for the pro-Kurdish party, who's the last one at the bottom, is saying that, hey, I'm a co-chairperson, and then the response is, I'm a co-chairperson, right? So that's where they're putting these parties together to say, when it comes to women in politics, we should see one stands out, whereas the AKP, the secular CHP, as well as the nationalist MHP, all of these parties are quite tone deaf to women's issues. In the case of Iran, as I said, we haven't had a history of women's of sort of political parties, but yet we do see sort of more push come around the time of elections of who is being more representative. And we also see that we do see important sort of maybe milestones is too strong of a word, but important sort of changes that happen, such as for the 10th Parliament, where the List of Hope actually promised, the reformist-backed List of Hope, actually promised that it was going to have a good number of women. They aspire to have 40% women in every multi-member district across Iran. Multi-member districts across Iran are quite limited. There's only 12 of them, but nonetheless, that meant that in Tehran's district, it would mean that you would have a good, 8 to 10 type of women. And sure enough, for that election, all of these women entered Tehran's district. And this was getting rid of all of the incumbent women who were there as part of the principalists, part of the conservative faction. What's also important with that election is that the women who entered, although they were not known to the general public, because all the known female candidates were disqualified by the Council of Guardians, a lot of them actually ended up being quite outspoken on women's rights issues. So this is where we actually see substantive and descriptive representation get covered. With regards to some of the discursive opportunities that I identified, by discursive opportunities, I mean, how are women's groups across the ideological spectrum, how are they articulating their demands? What language do they use? How do they frame their demands? Because we know the issue of women's political representation is quite contentious. It's contentious because it's about female authority, because it's potentially also about female authority over men. So this is where they have to be very careful with how to articulate and push for this particular demand in a society that definitely its elites are not ready for it. Maybe even some members of the general public might not be ready for it. Although, as I said, the cultural work has been done on a while. So what I found is that there's two dominant discourses that can be used. The first one is relying on international human rights discourse, that the women across the ideological spectrum have been very good at studying how have others, particularly what tools does the international community provide for us to argue for these demands. If you remember, I said that there was extensive campaigning happening in the mid-1990s. It's because the Beijing Platform for Action gave women a tool to be able to do so. Again, Dr. Tawakkoli Targhi and I were also talking about how Iranians have been really interested in studying the international human rights documents throughout history, and they've published a lot about it, including some of the high-ranking religious women from within the reformist movement. But one of the key cases where I saw this being particularly used was by religious women in Turkey, particularly, and one instance of that is to be able to campaign for headscarf women's access to the parliament or to politics. As we know, because of that secularization sort of legacy, there was a lot of sensitivity, particularly ever since sort of the late 1990s, as well as the early 2000s, to have headscarved women enter positions of power. And we know, some of you might remember the case of Merve Kavakci, who in 1999 was democratically elected to the parliament on behalf of a conservative party, religious party, but she was not allowed to take her vote, take her oath to serve, and she was kicked out of the parliament and kicked out of Turkey. So one of the ways that the Turkish women have been able to argue for this is to be able to say, well, CEDAW, which Turkey, the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that Turkey has signed and ratified, denies or expects there to be no discrimination. And obviously just discriminating against headscarf women is something that is limiting their rights, that's limiting their political rights. And through this language, they were able to force other political parties, including the Justice and Development Party, that at the first years of it being in power was not willing to necessarily address the headscarf issue because it knew what could happen to parties that actually touch on this particular issue. So eventually they succeeded through the language of CEDAW, and finally CEDAW committee's support. And in 2013, Erdogan announced the lifting of the headscarf ban. And this is Ravza Kavakci, which is a very symbolic election of hers in 2015, who's the younger sister of Merve Kavakci, the woman who, as I mentioned, was kicked out of the parliament in 1999. The other discourse that has been used is what I call the regime discourse, is where the members of the women's movement, again, across the ideological spectrum, are very good at basically using the language that is used by the ruling elites in order to sort of highlight the gaps that they see, in order to highlight the injustices that they see, and in order to say that women's greater access to politics is actually aligns with the values of the regime. In this regard, the revolutionary as well as the religious discourse in the case of Iran has been quite important, where we've had women's groups, including some secular women's groups, highlight the role of religious figures like Zainab or others, or even rely on the Quran, or even rely on Khomeini, someone who at the time of the revolution said women need to come out and vote. So some are actually using that terminology to say, well, obviously he saw women as being political actors, they meant right around the time of the revolution, only not previous to that, where he was opposing female suffrage. But nonetheless, sort of this type of language is then, if a country doesn't allow women to be in positions of political power, therefore it's un-Islamic, therefore it's unjust, therefore it's unrevolutionary. And they would put these in their official documents and statements to be able to say that what they're demanding is actually quite in line with what the regime has been advocating. And this is some of those moments where I said the ideological sort of coming together of women across the religious and secular divide has been happening in Iran. So I wanted to highlight some of the contributions of this research, of this particular book, as well as how we can then make sense of where we are today in the context of both countries, but particularly with the context of Iran. So one of the things that I try to highlight in this book is to say that when it comes to women's political rights, political participation, political representation, there are multiple factors and actors that impact women's political representation. It's not just the religion of Islam. In fact, the religion of Islam can sometimes support women's claims for greater access to politics, as we have seen, whereas in other cases, it actually hinders it, like the ruling on Rijal in the presidency, or like banning women from positions of judgeship, and so on and so forth. So we need to have a much more nuanced, much more complicated view of the role of religion. The other aspect is also highlighting how women themselves as agents are very good at consciously deciding how to go ahead and push for this, and that nothing is written in stone, and you do have movements sort of shifting between them, or activists actually moving within these sort of discourses. But women's continued agitation of the state, I think, is really important for us to keep in mind. As we said, it's been a historical agitation. This is a demand for greater access to politics is not new. It didn't just happen with women's campaigns to be in the parliament. It has a very historical, but in response, often from the state, what they've seen is what the literature has called the instrumentalization of women's rights, which is particularly what's happening in Turkey, where Erdogan and his allies were really good at just like putting token women there to appeal to the voters, to appeal to the international community, but then substantively actually taking away many fundamental rights away from women. But then also in the case of Iran, it's been mere lip service, right? Where there's been some politicians have been able to campaign very effectively on women's issues, but actually not deliver on a lot of these. And so women have also been really well aware that their rights have been instrumentalized. They've been given empty promises and not delivered. So women are demanding that substantive representation. And I think that's where the slogan of Women, Life, Freedom needs to be contextualized within, in the sense that Women, Life, Freedom didn't just happen in 2022. It's part of that long lasting sort of call to say, if women are intentionally marginalized from positions of power and from political influence, then obviously we can see that at some point that spark is going to happen, which again allows women to come in and demand for absolute equality, freedom, and non-discrimination. And currently what we're seeing is that there's the demand for radical change. And I think this is something that my book, where it ended, it was pointing to this. It was, I definitely was saying that, you know, we're seeing that women are getting more and more frustrated. Why else are they boycotting elections? Why else are they boycotting political parties? Why else are they turning their back, campaigning extensively? So I think women's political agency and aspirations and qualifications is really important. We're talking about a population that's very politically aware of their rights and what they want, and is tired of having men basically decide on their behalf, or others who have access to resources to decide for them. And what we're seeing right now is also a manifestation of those prior campaigns, those prior works that have laid the ground for that radical structural change that we're seeing today. So none of this is new. A lot of this is building on those historical systemic discrimination and marginalization that we're seeing. And when women's organizing for past decades and engagement with multiple actors, it's important, and it shouldn't be built, and it should be built upon rather than dismissed. I think that's another thing that I really want to emphasize, in the sense that if women were engaging with theocratic states, if women were engaging with patriarchal political parties, it was an aspect of their agency. It was because they were trying to try out these opportunities or these promises to see where they were going to lead. But if they were not going to lead anywhere, then obviously they weren't just going to lose hope. They were going to come back and agitate for even farther, for even more important changes. So this is where the Women, Life, Freedom slogan is quite significant in terms of women and politics and women's political representation. This is not the first time that women are actually at the forefront, including in the context of Iran. We've seen women at the forefront of many important social and political changes. I remember one of the researches that I did right after the 2009 protest. It was women who highlighted, and they said, we were very much at the forefront of that, right? Because we knew what was at stake, and because women were so active prior to that particular election. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that this is also another time that we see. And I think in this regard, experiences of systemic discrimination matter. The reason why women are at the forefront is also because they have a much better sense of what systemic discrimination means, right? I always use this analogy that the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States is very much at the forefront of asking for very important radical change. That's because they have those experiences of systemic discrimination, and they should be listened to. And so in this regard, we are seeing that they're leading this change. And again, they're leading this change not just because they're very angry, but also because they have a very good understanding of what their demands are, how they should articulate them. And I think in this regard is where we're seeing the charters of minimum demands that was just published on the anniversary of the 44 year of the Islamic Republic by labor unions, by women's groups, as well as sort of scholars and others who really outlined, what are their minimum demands? And their minimum demands is pointing to that radical change, although they call it minimum. Another example is the LGBTQ Communities Manifesto that was again published this year. These are really important sort of ways of clear articulation of demands. And as we know, women, again, who are political agents, who have a very good and long history of understanding systemic discrimination, of understanding where their empty promises have failed, again, are in a much better position to be able to push for this. And that's why the Iran Women's Bill of Rights is actually going to be published and announced on March 8th, 2023. So this is a teaser, consider this a teaser of that, where yes, we're gonna be, me and a group of other feminists are very keen of building on, as I said, the previous work that has been done to be able to say, this is that feminist demand in terms of gender equality, in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of secularism, in terms of all these particular changes that we're asking for, and clearly outline it to say these demands or these wishes didn't come out of the blue. They've been talked about, they've been thought through, and these are those ideal demands that we're having because this is that opportunity structure, because this is that particular moment that Mahsa's killing in September has provided us with an opportunity to be able to say, enough is enough. Enough is enough, and let's come together and collectively ask for these particular changes. So yes, I do want you guys to keep an eye out for that. The website is going to be iwbr.org, or IranWomenBillOfRights.org. It's not up yet, so don't go there yet. But yes, it will be up very soon on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, which also marks the time where Women of Iran was one of the first mass protests against the theocracy took place on March 8th, 1979, and it was by women. But unfortunately, at that time, they were not supported by men. This is the moment that hopefully we are seeing that men are finally in solidarity, joining forces with historically marginalized population. And with that, thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Tajali, for your timely and illuminating talk. Now, without further ado, we can take the questions from the participants. You can raise your hand, and I'll call you by your name to ask your question, or you can write your questions in the chat box, and I can see already hands up. Sarajan, please go ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm Dr. Tavakoli's one of his students. It was a pleasure to be here today, and I really enjoyed the lecture. Sorry about the noise around me, but I tried my best to keep it as short as possible. I have a question. When you, when you explain that women uprising is toward the change about, for example, their right and their recognition in the constitutional level. So they will be recognized, their right and their political leadership. To me, when we have some shifts or reformation in the constitution, not even about women, about a lot of other stuff that in the society happens. That's my understanding is that it's a top-down kind of, act. I was wondering, even if, let's say, this movement or even any uprising, any women uprising, if they are successful to make some kind of changes or some kind of approval they can make within in the constitutional level, how we can guarantee that it's going to be practiced in the ground level, it's going to be implemented about every woman, because not all the women would be involved in politics. There are some leaders, some of them have more opportunity to get involved in politics and those kind of stuff. If we are able to change the constitution or make some kind of additional stuff to approve women's rights, how we can guarantee that this is gonna bring equality in practice?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I can see your level of frustration also coming through, which, yes, we're all very frustrated of this regard. And that's exactly what I meant, that we need to have women as part of the decision maker, as part of the decision-making table where they've been intentionally sidelined and marginalized from. Is it specifically because of that? Is it specifically to prevent that, just you have these set of laws there and then they're not implemented, and then they're not becoming in reality. And that's also why I meant that the experiences of those that have experienced systemic discrimination are very well aware of how things can be very quickly taken away from. So that's one of the things that in our Bill of Rights or the Feminist Bill of Rights that is being put together, very intentionally also recognizing, giving some guidelines of how to ensure their protection. For instance, making sure that women are involved in political decision-making, not just at the national level, but also at the local and the provincial level, making sure that intersectional identities are also present. So that's one part where the experiences, and I think that's the beauty of Women Life Freedom, in the sense of it allows us to really capitalize to say that it's part and parcel with the larger pushes for democracy. It's part and parcel for the largest pushes for freedom, that it would actually be beneficial to men as well, right? It's not to say that you're prioritizing women at the cost of men. It's actually to say, no, if you want to have a truly pluralist society, truly democratic society, these need to be part and parcel. Going back to my example of like why the Black Lives Matter could actually deliver changes that benefits me, is that I'm an immigrant here in the United States. Could the changes that they manifest within the US structure, could it benefit me? For sure it could, right? Because they have those experiences versus, not having others. The other thing that you mentioned, which is that I think we also need to keep in mind that rights are given and then very quickly they can be taken away, right? And I think that's another thing that's important to keep in mind, that when we're talking about women's movements, and why I emphasize that what we're seeing right now is building on that history, is also that it's never to say that these struggles are ever going to end. I teach at Georgia in Atlanta, and I teach at a historically women's college. So I'm very keen to tell my students that, yesterday you might have had, bodily autonomy. Today, that right is taken away, right? Tomorrow, some other right could be taken away. So I think that's another thing for us to keep in mind, that these struggles need to continue, because you will always have groups, parties, institutions that want to specifically marginalize others, that want to specifically preserve their own interests. So I think recognizing that women's movements, again, are a really good, rich history that we can sort of rely on to say, we need to continue our protest regardless of who comes to power, what shape it takes. Is it a monarch? Is it a republican? Whoever it is, these dialogues and these sort of engagements need to continue.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Tajali. So the next question goes to Gonha, please.
Hello, my name is Gonha, and I am a student of Professor Tawakkoli as well. So thank you for your great, wonderful presentation. I found it very interesting, like in terms of its rich details, and it was very inspiring, very strong. So it kind of like led me to think about my own like research questions. So I'd like to pose my question based on feminist international relations theory, which sees that the gender and international relations is kind of related. For example, in a way that the domestic patriarchal logic is embedded in the foreign policy making, or like the international society like tend to intervene based on like the patriarchal logic that that they should protect Eastern women, or it should be them that should like empower those women. So I wondered, as you talked a lot about the domestic politics, like of like this woman. So do you have like any thoughts on whether this increasing roles of women, increasing representation of women in Iran and Turkey, have they or will they come up with any alternative view on international relations, or have they already like posed some like alternative like foreign policies in terms of what they would like to do like differently from the male decision-making agencies? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and very close to my heart, as well as the hearts of the group that I mentioned that I'm speaking with. And of course, as you know, I'm also collaborating as part of a transnational feminist solidarity network called the Women Living Under Muslim Laws. So yes, feminist IR. I studied feminist IR when I was in undergraduate, or maybe in my later, but it still boggles my mind why it's not utilized the way we have learned about it, and many feminist scholars, Cynthia Enloe, many others have sort of outlined it. So yes, I think, again, when I talked about like how much homework has been done on this, yes, the Iranian women and the Turkish women have done their homework. They have read these, and they do know that it is really important to talk about sort of a feminist foreign policy. One of the examples that you see of that right now coming out of the Women Life Freedom protests is that it's asking for a non-interventionist approach, right? It's asking for it's not asking for military intervention. It's not asking for, it's really saying, give women the support, give the population the support, the solidarity, in order to bring about the changes that they themselves are really good aware of, and that they themselves really know how to bring about. The other thing that also makes this quite real for the women of Iran and Turkey is also because the region has seen really dreadful interventions, particularly in Afghanistan and also in Iraq, right? So all of these sort of add to that body of knowledge that we're talking about with regards to how are the women themselves pushing for this. I think, yeah, utilizing UN 1325 is again specifically about women's political representation, that if any processes, any negotiations, any conflict that happens, including when it's civil conflict, women need to be at the decision-making table, right? Hence the title of my book of Demanding a Seat at the Table, is that women need to be there. Women shouldn't be there as just tokens. Women shouldn't be there just as window dressing. Unfortunately, that happens when you have patriarchal structures take the lead. Rather, they should be members of the women's movement. Rather, they should be individuals who have truly experienced the negative and gendered implications of war, like rape as a weapon of war. I mean, war and conflict has very gendered implications. And unless you have individuals who are at the forefront and have experienced these, lead these policies, I don't think you're going to see some real change. So I'm hoping that answers your question in that regard, that it's like the non-interventionist aspect is really interesting for me that I'm seeing come out.
Thank you so much. I think the next question goes to Mr. Momtaz Zadegan. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, excuse me, Professor Tajali, and thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli, for organizing these discussion sessions. As we all know, the time has changed and every time has its own requirement and exigencies. Unfortunately, no question about that. In the past, for a long time, the political arena, including the legislation bodies, was running by men, and unfortunately, women have been discriminated. Now, not only in Middle East, even in North America, in Europe, they are pushing to have fair, proportionate membership in the political system, including legislation of male and female. What I am looking here, it seems that we are pushing to establish some adversarial system to have equal membership of male and female. What I see and I would like to see is to change the mindset of the people, regardless of being men or women, of course. This must be open to both sexes, no question about that. But till the time that men are fighting for male right or female do the same, the problem will be there. We should remember what Saadi, the Persian poet, told us long ago, that we are all members or the limbs of the same body. Then if the pain and suffering of one is pain and suffering of all, then what I would like to see is to change the mindset of the people, whoever is running the politics, to protect the well-being of everybody, regardless of sex or any other segregations. This is, I think, the ideal to happen. How do you think this can happen?
Yeah, I think what I presented is specifically trying to talk about that specific mindset, the change in mindset. You're absolutely correct to highlight that historically, our legislative bodies have been dominated by men, not just in Iran, not just in Turkey, globally, right? The global average in terms of women's political representation, that the percentage of women being in parliaments is only at 25%. This is despite the fact that women are 51% of the world's population, right? So this is historical, this is nothing new. And of course, it's not at all unique to Iran or to the Muslim world or to Turkey or to any other country. What's really critical to keep in mind is that when I talked about women's political underrepresentation, I also flipped it and I emphasized male overrepresentation, where historically we have male overrepresentation in the sense that you have individuals who have taken the seats of those who should be there because their interests and their experiences are very unique, are very gendered, and they're not feeling represented. So when you're asking, when you present it in this way, when you talk about there's been male overrepresentation, then you're also undermining the fact that there is a non-democratic system. There's not a pluralist system because intentional sidelining of some voices have happened. When we're pushing for gender parity, which is equality between genders, so regardless of genders, that's exactly what we're asking. And that's exactly the point, that individuals, regardless of their gender, should be in positions of power in order to pursue the interests of a very pluralist society. The very pluralist society includes women, includes men, includes ethnic minorities, includes sexual minorities, includes everyone. If we have that understanding of pluralism and democracy, then it's actually, I really don't like to pit women's rights against men's rights in this regard. I'm rather highlighting the value of democracy, of pluralism. And when you think about that, there's been historical marginalization of a section of a society, then in order to bring about more democratic structures, then you need to ensure that there's gender parity that's being talked about. The reason why, for instance, the Bill of Rights is specifically talking about a women's Bill of Rights versus other Bill of Rights is because also this group feels that it's important for women's interests to specifically be addressed because of that historical sidelining of women's rights. So I think these two need to be kept into mind. And that's why I said fighting for women's rights, women, life, freedom is definitely not one that is saying pitting women's rights against men's rights. Women, life, freedom is asking for a radical democratic Iran, one that also pays attention to this historical marginalization of this particular gender, while also taking into account other discriminations, other sidelinings that has been happening. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. I can see Professor Homa Houtfar is here. Please, Professor Houtfar.
Thank you. Thank you to Mr.